Welcome to Lecture 13, which is the Union Breaks, 1850 to 59. So this is going to be a series of incidents that are going to push the North and South further and further apart, and the nation as a whole closer to the Civil War. We will start with where we left off in the previous unit, which is the Fugitive Slave Law, part of the Compromise of 1850. This was designed to appeal to Southerners by giving them a chance at recovering their stolen property or their runaway property. But it caused a firestorm of Northern opposition. First of all, the fact that the federal government would be in control of the process was terribly bothersome to Northerners. Forcing Northern citizens to be helpers in this process, and the fact that slaves didn't have any rights, was exceptionally problematic for many Northerners. In response, many Northern states passed personal liberty laws, which basically nullified the Fugitive Slave Act. So in some ways, the North is taking a pretty radical stance that we mostly associate with the South. The last time, in fact, we talked about nullification, we talked about South Carolina nullifying a federal law. And now we've got Northern states doing it. A literary response to the crisis came from Harriet Beecher Stowe in her Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was originally a newspaper serial, so a chapter we published, the next week another chapter, the next week another chapter, and then collected into a book. Based on Stowe's experiences with runaway slaves as she lived in Cincinnati. And she came into contact with people who were escaping slavery by running from Kentucky over the border into Ohio. Stowe was part of a very well-known antebellum family as well. The Beechers are everywhere in antebellum America. The family is well associated with the Second Great Awakening, preachers. Her sister Catherine is one of the key architects for the cult of domesticity. So it's kind of no surprise that Harriet Beecher Stowe would be involved in a social reform cause because her whole family was. In the first year of publication, it sold 300,000 copies, and it was exceptionally popular because it had 6 full illustrations, so you could see the impact of her ideas drawn for you on paper as it told the story of a runaway slave. A girl who with her baby flees across the frozen Ohio River, tries to get her freedom. Meanwhile, she's being pursued by evil and wicked slave catchers. And you're supposed to feel for her. So the novel is very much an appeal to pathos, emotions, and feelings. The Northerners who read the novel were incredibly shaped by its storytelling, and they not only got a chance to read it, but it was converted into a stage play, so if you were not quite as literate as everyone else, you could still see the story put on for you. We can measure in some ways how popular it was because the lead character of the novel, Eliza, establishes a name that will become popular with Northern parents. And so you see in the decade after Uncle Tom's Cabin, all of these children being born named Eliza. Southerners were, of course, incensed. They said Stowe was lying. She was not being honest about the South. They noted this, of course, because they'd spent, the last 20 years trying to tell everybody that slavery is a positive good. And to have this person write about them in such a way as to portray them as wicked and evil, well, it just calls them out for being wicked and evil. Everywhere in the North, whether you read Stowe or not, you could see evidence of the Fugitive Slave Act as people were caught and put on trial and shipped back to the South, such as the case of Anthony Burns in Boston. Abolitionists in the North often put out posters to tell colored folks, as they said in this poster here on the right, to watch out because you might be talking to somebody who could be a slave catcher or a kidnapper. This poster in Boston was intended to encourage the people to rally against kidnapping as a person has been captured and will be taken back to the South. Here is the Beecher family. Stowe is the far right. Her father in the middle is a very prominent minister. Her brothers were all involved in reform causes. It's incredible family in terms of just their effect on Northern antebellum social reform and culture. Here's the title page of Uncle Tom's Cabin and another picture of Stowe. Here's an illustration from a traveling theater performance of Uncle Tom's Cabin as Eliza is running with her baby, kind of an ugly looking baby if you kind of look at it, weird Voldemort looking face. She looks almost white because in the book she is a little bit lighter skinned. But of course at this time you would have had no black actresses playing any of these roles. Very, very rarely would you see an African American on stage in antebellum America at all. So white actors played it, often with blackface on. The hullabaloo over the Fugitive Slave Act is going to signal the end of the Whig Party. In the 1852 election, Whigs are going to flounder because the Southern Whigs are going to vote Democrat, thinking that the Northern Whigs and the Whig Party in general is just not safe on the issue of slavery. The other thing that's going to kill the Whigs is the rise of a distraction, a sort of kind of momentary squirrel moment known as the Know-Nothing Party. Know-Nothings are nativists, so they dislike immigrants, and they believe immigrants are a threat to the United States. They're deeply concerned about foreign influence. Originally, they started as a secret society, the Loyal Order of the Star-Spangled Banner, and when questioned, they were supposed to tell everybody, "I know nothing," so hence the nickname Know-Nothings. They despised Irish Catholics and Germans. Catholics because the Catholic faith is not well regarded in America. Irish and Germans too because of traditions of drinking and alcohol culture. So in the wake of the temperance movement, it's not particularly cool to be a drinker. In response to this immigrant threat, there is a call for temperance to strike down people's drinking, and a call for stronger citizenship laws to keep these immigrants from influencing American politics. So the nativists are going to steal votes from Northern Whigs, as the Southern Whigs are leaving the Whig Party. Meanwhile, the issue of slavery doesn't really go away, despite this momentary distraction. Southerners are still agitating over slavery. For example, they call for the seizure of Cuba to make it a slave state. And one Southerner actually attempts to invade Nicaragua and turn it into a slave state. And eventually his coup in Nicaragua is stopped and he is executed by firing squad. Here's the election of 1852. The candidates are Franklin Pierce, who is a Democrat, very pro-expansion Democrat. General Winfield Scott, who's a Whig and a war hero, who's a hero in war, and yet still he doesn't get the vote. And the Free Soil Party runs John Parker Hale on the Wilmot Proviso of no slavery in the West. Pierce wins. This chart shows migration between 1830 and 1860, and you could kind of see why Northerners are getting a little bit concerned about slavery, not slavery, but immigrants, this momentary distraction from slavery, because in 1830, not a whole lot of Irish and Germans, quite a few more in 1840, but by 1850, there's a more than tenfold growth in the number of Irish and Germans that are showing up. So if you live in the North, you can look out your windows and see these migrants on the street and note to yourself, gosh, there certainly are a lot more Irish now, certainly a lot more Germans now. And the Irish weren't particularly well regarded, so in fact, they're not even considered white in antebellum America. They're often drawn as dark-skinned, swarthy, dirty, and ape-like. Here's the Know-Nothing's portrait of the idealist sort of citizen. He's a very smart-looking young man, bold thinker, and definitely not one of those dark Irish or beer-drinking Germans. Here's a Know-Nothing polka dedicated to everybody by nobody. Here is a membership banner to indicate that you belong to the Native American Republican Association, which is a nativist organization. Beware of foreign influence is their motto. They've got George Washington at the top. And for a while, nativists will be pretty popular in northern cities. But eventually, northerners will come back to the issue of slavery. And what will draw them back in is Kansas. In 1854, the territory of Kansas is being organized for statehood. But there's a lot of question about whether it should be a free or slave territory. Now, technically, under the Missouri Compromise, it should be a free territory. But a lot of Southerners are feeling that it's unfair to keep them out of the territories. They feel like it belongs to the whole country, and they should have just as much as right as anybody to go west. So Stephen A. Douglas proposes the Kansas-Nebraska Act to organize this territory, but he's got to make both Northerners happy and Southerners happy. He has an interest in getting it organized because he would like to build a railroad, and he would like to use, his investments in Illinois to direct the railroad to be built through areas that he has an interest in, and so he needs to get Kansas organized to make this happen. So to make Kansas a state, he proposes that the people who move there will be able to vote on slavery through popular sovereignty, which basically is a repeal of the Missouri Compromise. If you allow them to vote on slavery, and it's north of 3630, you're abandoning the Missouri Compromise. No ifs, no buts, no coconuts. The way that people come to think about Kansas is then, if it's going to be popular sovereignty, we need to flood Kansas with people who can vote the way we want. So both Northerners and Southerners flood into Kansas, and that leads to territorial bloodshed. Kansas bleeds. Because Southerners who want slavery, Northerners who don't want slavery, end up coming into conflict with each other. Violence breaks out between 1855 and 1856. 200 people are killed. There's $2 million in property damage, which is about $56 billion today. So it's quite extensive, the damage that's done. And Kansas quickly becomes a national discussion about why allowing slavery in the West is not going to work out going forward. You can see the map here. Kansas is north of the Missouri Compromise line, so technically there should be no slavery up here. But thanks, Stephen Douglas, you're going to allow the people to vote on it. So Southerners pour into Kansas. Northerners pour into Kansas as well. From the free soil point of view, it looks like slavery is being shoved down the throat of the free soil people who want to live in Kansas. So here, literally, a settler in the West is having slavery shoved down his throat by Stephen Douglas. and Franklin Pierce. And over here on the other side is James Buchanan and Lewis Cass holding the settler down. This cartoon suggests that Kansas is being raped by Douglas and Pierce and Cass. In fact, Douglas is over here on the side actually scalping someone. It's a pretty gruesome image of what Free Soilers think is going on in Kansas. Indeed, it was pretty violent. The worst two incidents of violence are Lawrence. The whole town of Lawrence is a free soil town. It is sacked and burned by pro-slavery advocates. In response to that, an anti-slavery crusader by the name of John Brown takes his sons out one evening, and they murder 5 slaveholders in Pottawatomie Creek. So I guess he's working under the assumption that the family that slays together stays together. The hullabaloo over Kansas leads to the birth of a new political party, the Republicans. Part of the issue is allowing slavery in a place where slavery is not supposed to be is deeply an insult to the North. Why even have a Missouri Compromise if you're not going to follow it? Part of it is also the fact that clearly on the ground, pro-slavery forces are engaging in fraud, deceit, and trickery. For example, in the 1857 election, there are 6,307 ballots, but only 3,000 voters. Where are all those extra votes coming from? Pro-slavery Missouri people crossing the border and illegally voting. The territory of Kansas then becomes divided between 2 rival governments, with free soil leaders trying to make Kansas free soil, but being attacked by pro-slavery leaders. And the violence actually spills over into Congress, as Republicans are trying to say to the public, look, free soil and the future of the West is actually a really important problem, and we should probably stop worrying about nativism for the moment. In 1856, on the floor of Congress, a Northern congressman gets his head beat in by a Southerner over the issue of Kansas. It starts when Senator Charles Sumner is giving a speech about Kansas, and in his speech, he makes some rather insulting, lewd comments about South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler. Well, the next day, Congressman Preston Brooks, who happens to be Butler's relative, comes into the Senate and he beats Sumner unconscious with a cane. He actually breaks the cane because the beating is so savage. He promptly resigns Congress, goes back home to South Carolina, and people mail him replacement canes that say, "Hit him again." It's such a shocking attack because the Senate is supposed to be a place where people deliberate and make decisions based on facts and evidence and policy and think through things as wise statesmen. And instead, there's just all-out violence on the floor of Congress. Northerners condemn this as an act of free speech violation. How can you have free speech if Southerners are just going to beat you for the arguments that you make? So what exactly did Sumner say that got him beaten and caused him to have to recover for the next 3 years? Andrew Butler has taken a mistress, ooh, saucy, who though ugly to others is always lovely to him, though polluted in the sight of the world is chaste in his sight. I mean the harlot, slavery. Wow, that's some pretty intense language there. So here this cartoonist, drawing from the northern point of view, suggests that free speech is being shut down. Notice that Sumner's holding a pen. He's falling to the ground in an act of, oh, I'm being silenced by violence, as the cane is coming down upon his head, matted with his blood and flesh. Another cartoon shows the same incident. Notice once again he's looking away as if he's looking off into the heavens and justice and a world of pure thought. The symbol of the North is the pen, the symbol of the South is the bludgeon, said Henry Ward Beecher, one of those Beechers. So the year of Brooks Sumner also happens to be an election year, and it's the first time that Republicans can sort of get a presidential candidate out there and see how well they do. So the nation's first truly sectional party, well, I guess I should say successful sectional party, because really the Liberty Party is pretty sectional. Really the Free Soil Party is pretty sectional. But Republicans are actually successful at it. Ran on a slavery issue in the West, which they got from Free Soilers. Their candidate was John C. Fremont, whose motto was free soil, free speech, and Fremont. The Democrats endorsed popular sovereignty, and they picked James Buchanan, who wins. Meanwhile, in Kansas, the two sides are fighting it out, and the pro-slavery side writes a constitution, the Lecompton Constitution, which endorses a pro-slavery Kansas, and it's a total fraud. It's a total sham. It's not supported by the people of Kansas at all. So they send it to Buchanan. Buchanan's like, hey, I like it. It's good. But Congress says, oh, hold up here. No, this Lecompton Constitution's a fraud. It's a joke. We are not accepting this. Kansas is not allowed to become a state. They're a mess. They're a hot mess. And they cannot become a state until they work it out. So Kansas will remain a territory until 1861. You can see in the election of 1856 that it's pretty sectional. The North votes for Fremont, and the rest of the country votes Buchanan. Here are the candidates: Buchanan, Democrat; Fremont, Republican. The Whig know-nothing sort of remnants run a candidate, and his name is Millard Fillmore. You might recognize the name because he was president for a hot second after Zachary Taylor kicked the bucket for eating cherries and ice milk. By the mid-1850s, we can see that the North and the South are clearly divided. The North believing in the superiority of free labor, middle-class values, urban life, commerce, all the things that define the North, and clearly thinking that it's superior to everything else. They're going to vote Republican, and they're going to say that slavery is backwards, not only economically, but religiously, and that we're headed for a showdown over slavery. The South is going to identify around the belief in their hierarchical society, that some people are clearly better than others, and that slaves definitely belong on the bottom, that agriculture creates the best society, cotton, that's where it's at. They're going to vote Democrat. And they oppose free labor, saying that free labor is a joke, that really you're just a wage slave. You're just selling your labor to somebody who basically owns you. You can see this sectionalism in this political chart produced by the Rocky Mountain Club of Springfield, Ohio, for the election of John C. Fremont. And what they did was they gathered all these statistics to show how much better the North was. The North's better in how many people go vote. The North's better if you count attendance of children to school. The North's better if you count literacy. They say the North is better if you're looking at libraries. They're saying the North is better when you look at the value of churches. The North has more newspapers. So all the way around, the North is a better place. Now, you could quibble with the statistics because there's definitely some not so good inferences here from it. But from the Northern standpoint, they say that everything about their world is better than the Southern world. In 1857, a case comes before the Supreme Court that should help kind of maybe clarify slavery and slavery's future, except it just makes things worse. The question is, before the court, does living in a free territory make a slave free? That is, if you're enslaved and your master takes you somewhere where slavery is banned, are you automatically free then? What is the meaning of property? Does it exist everywhere, is what this case is asking. The Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is Roger Taney, who is a slave owner from Maryland. So you can kind of guess where this case might lean and where it might head. So it's probably not a surprise that Taney says that slaves are not federal citizens and that the founders never intended them to be citizens at all. Taney says that living in free territory doesn't change your status any more than, sitting in your garage makes you a car. That if you're property, you're always property everywhere. But here's where things get really bad. Taney could have stopped there, but he didn't. He declared that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional. You can't ban slavery because that bans people's property. And if you're banning their property, well, you're taking their rights away from them. Where did he get that idea? The Fifth Amendment. Taney said that the Fifth Amendment guarantees your protection of your private property. The government can't take that away from you. And if they're telling you you can't go west and live in Kansas, well, they're basically denying you an opportunity that other people are getting. This case intensifies sectionalism. Northerners now become fearful that Taney's decision opens up the possibility of slavery expanding to the North. After all, if property is property and you can take it anywhere, what's to stop Southerners from moving to New York with their property? Good question. There's Roger Brooke Taney, looking like his face is a little bit melted, and Dred Scott, looking surprised or like he said way too much caffeine. The issue in Dred Scott was raised further in 1858 in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. In Illinois in 1858, Abraham Lincoln was trying to win Stephen Douglas's Senate seat. So he challenged Douglas to a series of debates, very long debates, in fact, where they basically read argumentative essays out loud. Lincoln made a number of statements in the debates, famously arguing that the nation could not be half slave and half free, is one of his most famous things that he says. He says, we're either going to become all slave or all free, but we can't be split. We can't be halvesies. But his most important contribution to the debate was where he pushed Douglas to take the decision in Dred Scott and reconcile it with Douglas's belief in popular sovereignty. I mean, you might be thinking, well, what's the contradiction there? Well, think about it. Dred Scott is property everywhere. Popular sovereignty says the people who live in an area can vote whether or not to have slavery. Well, those two things can't be both true. Either property is property everywhere, or people have the right to decide what property is going to exist or not exist. You can't have both of those. They can't share the same space legally. So Douglas thought about it, and he came up with this kind of wishy-washy answer. At Freeport, Illinois, Douglas said that he believed in Dred Scott, but he said whatever the Supreme Court's decision, it still requires the people who live in an area to decide to protect slavery if they really want it. In other words, he's saying a law isn't a law unless people enforce it. Sure, your property is property, but if you move to an area where people refuse to protect your property, well, essentially then your property can't exist there. And that was Douglas's response. Namely, people can just break the law because they refuse to protect it. Well, this kind of response doesn't hold for Southerners who think, okay, Douglas, you could have had a much stronger response than that. The response doesn't hold too well for Northerners either, so this is going to hurt Douglas in the long run. He still wins the Senate seat, but eventually this will cost him the presidency in 2 years. So here is the Lincoln-Douglas debates. They were 3-hour debates spread over 7 towns between August and October of 1858. 3 hours of debating. I don't think Americans would have the stamina for that today. Lincoln famously said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I don't expect the Union to be dissolved. I don't expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided." As we come to an end to this lecture, we have one final explosive incident of the 1850s. That's right, John Brown's back. In 1859, John Brown attempted to seize a federal weapons arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. It's now West Virginia today. His plan was take the weapons, distribute it to slaves, and create a slave uprising. As you might see from the picture here, Harper's Ferry looks like it's a pretty isolated mountainous area. And indeed, it's not really a great place to foment a large-scale slave uprising. So the raid fails, Brown's captured, but it triggers all kinds of reactions. Southerners are triggered about this, thinking, oh gosh, what if our slaves actually do cause a rebellion? Oh my goodness, will I make it through tonight? Will I be killed in my sleep? Southerners are also angry because Northerners actually praise Brown. Northerners say Brown is a martyr. He's helping to deal with the problem of slavery, and gosh darn it, he's such a good guy. So Southerners end up saying that black Republicans like Brown and Lincoln and everybody else were trying to tear apart the Union by causing real slave war, or race war, as many Southerners said. Indeed, Brown was supported by 6 Northerners that were nicknamed the Secret Six. We now actually know who they are, so they're not so secret anymore. Notice ministers, journalists, merchants here. The transcendentalist writer Ralph Waldo Emerson said, "John Brown is that new saint, than whom none purer or more brave was ever led by love of men into conflict and death. The new saint awaiting his martyrdom, and who, if he shall suffer, will make the gallows glorious like the cross." Well, dang, John Brown is Jesus. John Brown at his sentencing said, "Now, if it is deemed necessary that I should forfeit my life for the furtherance of the ends of justice, and mingle my blood further with the blood of millions in the slave country whose rights are disregarded by wicked, cruel, and unjust enactments, I say, let it be done." So we are now at the doorstep of civil war, and that will be the next lecture.